نفهم أن المستوطنين اليهود الأوائل الذين جاءوا إلى فلسطين تحت أيديولوجية الصهيونية في أواخر القرن التاسع عشر تم قبولهم من قبل الفلسطينيين. لم يروا فيهم خطرا، رأوا أنهم أوروبيون فقراء يريدون العيش في فلسطين، ولم يحاول أحد طردهم.
أتذكر مقولتك اللي من الجيد أن نذكر بها مرة أخرى عندما قلت أغلب الصهاينة لا يؤمنون بوجود الله، لكنهم يؤمنون بأنه وعدهم بأرض فلسطين.
نعم، لا يعرف الكثير من الناس أن الصهيونية بدأت كفكرة إنجيلية مسيحية قبل أن يبدأ المفكرون والناشطون اليهود في أوروبا الشرقية في تبني فكرة الصهيونية. ولهذا السبب أزعم أن الحركة الصهيونية منذ البداية اعتقدت أن لها الحق في التطهير العرقي للفلسطينيين وإزالتهم.
كيف لمشروع سياسي أن يقوم على محو الآخر؟ ولما قام ظهر في ثوب الحداثة والتحضر والديمقراطية مع إنكار على مدى نحو 8 عقود لما سببه من نكبة لهذا الآخر، لعل الأمر ينسى على مر الأجيال. الحديث عن التطهير العرقي في فلسطين لم يحظى وما زال لا يحظى باهتمام الأنظمة الغربية التي أسهمت وساعدت على تمكين هذا المشروع السياسي، ولم يتطرق له الإعلام الغربي التقليدي الذي من مصلحته تمكين السردية السائدة والدفاع عنها، وهذا بلا شك على حساب المنكوب. إلا أن التعتيم على الحقيقة وعدم السماح للوصول إلى الوثائق والتسجيلات لم يمنع بعض المؤرخين والأكاديميين بصحوة الضمير، خاصة اليهود منهم، من الكتابة عن هذا الأمر الذي ليس حادثاً عرضياً، بل مشروع منظم لإزالة شعب عن أرضه ووطن عن خريطته التاريخية، كما فعل المؤرخ الإسرائيلي اليهودي إيلان بابيه الذي دفع ثمناً بسبب مؤلفاته. أهلاً بكم في 50 دقيقة. له الكثير من المؤلفات، خصص أغلبها عن التطهير العرقي في فلسطين مستنداً على شهادات عينية ووثائق. نبش في التاريخ ليضع أمام القارئ رواية تنسف الروايات المزيفة التي تحاول إخفاء الحقيقة، وشخص الصهيونية منذ التفكير بإنشائها وصولاً إلى ما حققته حتى اللحظة. أرحب بضيفي من الناصرة بالمؤرخ الإسرائيلي إيلان بابيه. بروفيسور إيلان، أهلا بك معنا في برنامج 50 دقيقة. سعيد أن يكون هذا اللقاء الثاني معك، ولكن هذه المرة ضمن برنامج 50 دقيقة ومساحة زمنية أوسع لنغتنم الفرصة معك ونعرف الكثير. أهلا بك. بداية بروفيسور إيلان، في أذهان الكثيرين تحديدا في أذهان العرب عندما يقال المشروع الصهيوني يظنون بأنه بدأ يهوديا، وأنت ممن نبه وقال لا، المشروع الصهيوني بدأ مسيحيا يمينيا. إذا كان لك أن تفسر أكثر لمشاهدينا عن هذه النقطة.
Yes, definitely. First of all, thank you for having me on this important program. Yes, not many people know that Zionism began as a Christian evangelical idea before even Jewish thinkers and activists in Eastern Europe began to subscribe to the idea of Zionism. This was because there was a stream, a group, an important group within evangelical Christianity, within Protestant Christianity, that believe that what they called the return of the Jews to the Holy Land would bring back Jesus Christ, the resurrection of the dead, the beginning of the end of time. So it was a religious motivation for pushing the Jews to leave Europe or the United States and to come to Palestine. But of course, this was not just because they thought that the Jewish return, as they called it, to Palestine would serve the religious purpose, they were also anti-Semitic. So they didn't mind, of course, to see the Jews not living in their own countries. But it was definitely a very important group within the coalition that later on included the Jewish intellectuals and British imperialists that began to say that Palestine has to be in the future a Jewish state. Needless to say that all these discussion about the future of Palestine in the mid-19th century and late 19th century were done without any consultation with the Palestinians themselves.
طيب إذن كيف انتقلت إلى اليهودية فيما بعد؟ كيف اعتنقها اليهود ووظفوها خدمة للمشروع وهو إقامة إسرائيل فيما بعد؟
There were two groups of Jews that became attracted to the idea that the Jews, especially the Jews of Europe, should go to Palestine and build a Jewish state there. One group was Jews who lived in what then was the Russian Empire and really suffered from persecution, racism, and felt that Russia and other Eastern European countries will never accept them as equal Europeans. And although many of them thought that the solution for that kind of persecution was to go actually to the United States or Britain, a minority of them became enchanted with the idea that maybe the best is to try and build a European Jewish state in Palestine instead of hoping to be treated as equals in Europe. The other group, which was very important among the Jews, were Jews from places such as Britain, who never thought, and never did, in fact, thought of going to Palestine, but were actually alarmed by the fact that because of the persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe, these Jews would come to England. They didn't want them in England. They thought that they would be revolutionary, unstable, and therefore they supported the idea in order to divert these Jews from Britain, or later the United States, into Palestine. All of this was aided by a very small group of Jewish intellectuals, like the founder of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, who began to think that maybe anti-Semitics are right, that Jews are a nation by themselves. So if you are a German Jew, you can never be a German because Judaism is a nationality, like German is a nationality. And they began to be fascinated by the idea that maybe they can rebuild what they once read about in the Bible, about the old Jewish kingdoms in the days of the kings of David and Solomon, ancient Israel, then maybe they can rebuild the glory of ancient Israel in the land of Palestine and turn Judaism from a religion into nationalism, which of course did not work in the end of the day, but this was an important motivation. So to sum up, I would say you had here, and it's very important to understand it, you had here a coalition of people who wanted to turn Palestine from an Arab country into a Jewish country for different reasons. The British imperialists wanted it because it helped them to expand the British Empire into the Arab world. The Christian evangelicals wanted it because they believed this is what God wants. The Jewish intellectuals thought that this would modernize Judaism, that this would solve anti-Semitism. So altogether, they created a powerful coalition that, with the help, of course, of the British Empire, before and during the First World War, succeeded in translating this idea into a new reality on the land of Palestine.
الدور البريطاني دور لافت، سأعود إليه في جزئية أخرى أسألك عنها، بس قبل ذلك اليهود الذين عارضوا المشروع الصهيوني، أنا بعرف أنه اليهودية الحريدية آنذاك عارضت هذا. لماذا هؤلاء اليهود عارضوا هذا المشروع اللي كان من المفترض أن يخدمهم ويبني لهم وطنا على أرض فلسطين؟
I would say that until the Holocaust that began in 1939, most of the Jews in the world objected to Zionism. Not only the Orthodox Jews, the Haredim whom you mentioned, they thought that you have to wait for God for returning to Palestine, and creating a Jewish state is tampering with the will of God. This is why quite a few Haredi Jews today still reject Zionism. But not only ultra-Orthodox Jews rejected Zionism. Also, Jews who believed in liberalism or socialism rejected Zionism. They thought that the solution for anti-Semitism is to create a better world, not to create a nationalist Jewish state elsewhere. So I would say until the 1930s, the vast majority of Jews in the world were not attracted to the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. The Holocaust, the trauma of the Holocaust, the attempt to genocide, not the attempt, the genocide of the Jews in Europe persuaded a much larger number of Jews to believe in Zionism. But to begin with, this, for most Jews, whether they were secular or very religious, it looked a very impractical idea and not something that they were wishing for.
طيب اليوم في إسرائيل نقول صهيونية علمانية وصهيونية دينية. إذن ما الفرق بينهما في هذه الحالة؟
Yes, today you have two camps. You definitely have two camps, and there is this kind of war between these two camps because of the problem of defining a religion, Judaism, as nationalism. It's also difficult to define Islam as nationalism or Christianity as nationalism. It doesn't work. And this is the reason you have these two camps. So you have, on the one hand, a group of Israelis who believe that being a Jew does not mean that you have to be a practicing Jew, a religious Jew, that this is just a national ethnic identity, and you can lead a liberal democratic life. I would say that this democratic life does, unfortunately, in their eyes, do not include the Palestinians, whether they are citizens of Israel or in the occupied territories. And then you have the religious Jews who believe that if Israel is to be a Jewish state, it has to be run according to the ancient Jewish law. So it has to be much more a theocratic state, not a liberal state. There are also differences between the two camps in the relationship towards the Palestinians. At least in the secular camp, at least some of them are willing to see a Palestinian state next to Israel. But when it comes to the religious nationalist camp, that is now the most important camp in Israel, they don't believe that the Palestinians have any rights.
أتذكر مقولتك اللي من الجيد أن نذكر بها مرة أخرى عندما قلت أغلب الصهاينة لا يؤمنون بوجود الله لكنهم يؤمنون بأنه وعدهم بأرض فلسطين. إذا ممكن أن نتوقف مرة أخرى عند هذه المقولة.
Yes, it's very important to understand that the Zionists who built the state of Israel, the one who were really running the state of Israel until the 1970s, and definitely the one who laid the foundation for a Jewish state in Palestine, were secular Jews who wanted to modernize Judaism and did not want to be any more regarded as religious Jews. But they used the Bible as a political text, not as a religious text, because they understood that a lot of Christians would support the Zionist movement on the basis of the Old Testament, on the basis of the Bible, and they hoped, and they succeeded, that with time they would also convince religious Jews that colonizing Palestine, settling in Palestine, is a religious imperative. But to begin with, this was not a movement of religious Jews trying to build a religious Jewish state. This was a proper colonialist project, very similar to other colonialist projects of Europeans who felt unwelcome in Europe, in fact, felt under danger in Europe, and still wanted to be Europeans. So they decided to build a European state outside of Europe instead of the Europe that didn't want them. And in the case of Palestine, they chose a land in the heart of the Arab world, in the heart of the Muslim world, where already people were living, and already people had their own ideas of their own right for self-determination, for independence. But I would like to stress, this is not the only case in history. The Europeans who came and settled in North America, or in Australia, or in South Africa, were also Europeans who felt insecure in Europe itself. And they colonized these new countries, but also in these new countries, that is in North America, Australia, South Africa, there were indigenous native people, and we know what they did to them. They genocided them in most cases. In the case of Palestine, the Zionist movement also saw the local Palestinian as the main problem for the fulfillment of the idea of a Jewish state. And this is why I claim that the Zionist movement from the very beginning believed that it had the right to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, to remove them, in order to build the European Jewish state that they wanted instead of the Europe that didn't want them.
ما الفرق بين التوراة والتلمود؟ لأنه هناك من يقول التلمود هو تحريف، جعلوه ميثاق سياسي، وأيضا ما هو التناخ؟ بحسب ما بعرف التناخ هو جمع للتوراة نيفوئيم كتوبيم.
Yeah. It's very important. Most Jews before the arrival of Zionism were studying mainly the Talmud. This is like, in Arabic you would call it tafsir in a way. These are the interpretation of the Bible, and generation and generation of Jewish scholars trying to understand how to translate the basic ideas in the Bible into a set of regulations, of law, of practices. First of all, between one person to the other, and then between the person, the faithful, and God. There's very little there about the need to build a state or to take over Palestine. This was never part of Jewish learning, of Jewish thought. It dealt with issues between the faithful themselves, the faithful and the non-Jewish community, and the faithful and God. What the leaders of the Zionist movement did very cleverly, they took the Old Testament itself, the Torah itself, the text itself, which was never the text that was the most important text for Jews throughout their generations. And they turned it into the most important text because they could use the stories in the Torah to say, actually, this is the Kushan. This is the proof that this land was, to begin with, a Jewish, an Israelite land, using the stories in the Bible and using the names in the Bible to claim that actually what were, by the time that they emerged, Palestinian cities and villages, that actually these were not Palestinian Arab villages, that these were Jewish villages that the Palestinians took from the Jews, unjustly took from the Jews. What is incredible about the Zionist story, and I try to tell that in all my books, that this incredible story that doesn't stand any chance to be regarded as normal, that I can knock on your door and say, excuse me, I used to live here 2,000 years ago, and I have the Bible to prove it, and therefore your house belongs to me, that this story was able to convince people in the Christian world in particular, and then in the Jewish world, that this is really a justification to colonize Palestine. And it was not only to justify the settlement of Jews in Palestine, but to dispossess the Palestinian from Palestine. Because I think we all understand that the first Jewish settlers who came under the ideology of Zionism to Palestine in the late 19th century were accepted by the Palestinians. They didn't see them as a danger. They thought that these were poor Jews, poor Europeans who wanted to live in Palestine, and nobody tried to expel them. It's only when the Palestinians, of course, realized that these settlers don't want to live alongside the Palestinians, but instead of the Palestinians, then really the conflict, as we call it, began. But it is very important to understand the difference between what we call in English the narrative, the story that the movement, the Zionist movement, is building, and then what they do in the name of the story. What I mean by that I don't care whether I am or not a descendant, I'm a Jew, so that the viewers would know. I don't care if it's true that I'm a descendant of someone who lived in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. This is not important whether it's right or wrong. The question, what do I do in the name of this story? Does this story allows me to kick out the Palestinians from Jerusalem? Morally, I think it doesn't. But the reality is that it was possible because the West, the Christian world, supported this idea for its own interests.
صراحة تفسير جدا رائع. أمامنا الكثير من الأسئلة، ولكن أريد أن أطمئن إن كان لديك ما يكفي من القهوة، لأنه تفسيرات جدا رائعة ونحن نتحدث إليك. في يمكنك الحصول على المزيد إذا بتحب. في اللقاء السابق.
Thank you. I had my coffee break.
جيد جدا.
No, I'm okay. Thank you so much. I'm okay.
في اللقاء السابق معك عندما سألتك عن اللورد أنتوني آشلي كوبر ابتسمت حينها، قلت أنه هذا سيكون مخصص له جزء في كتابك الجديد. أنتوني آشلي كوبر اللي كتب عن مستقبل اليهود في عام 1839، ما الدور الذي لعبه حين ذاك في التأسيس لتأييد بريطاني لليهود؟
Yes. His official title was Lord Shaftesbury, and he was very important in pushing forward the Christian world, especially the Christian world in Britain, towards supporting the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. He was related to Lord Palmerston, who in the period that he began to be active around 1839, 1840, was the Prime Minister of Britain. And he believed that, first of all, from a Christian point of view, building a Jewish state in Palestine, by the way, he thought it could even stretch over what today is Syria and Jordan, would, first of all, be God's will and would lead to the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the beginning of the end of time. But he was also an imperialist. At the time that he was active, 1840, the British policymakers did not want to disintegrate the Ottoman Empire. They believed, by the way, rightly, that if Britain would push for the fall of the Ottoman Empire, that would lead to a war in Europe over the possessions of the empire, which in fact is what happened in the First World War. So Britain in 1840 did not show any wish to take over the parts of the Arab world that were under the Ottoman Empire. But Lord Shaftesbury, Ashley Cooper, was part of a group that was lobbying in Britain to change the policy, claiming that Britain needs to control directly parts of the Arab world because this would open the way to a more easy control of India and Southeast Asia. This group of people has pushed Britain to occupy Egypt in 1882 and later to think about taking over Palestine, Iraq of today, and Jordan of today. So he, because of his prominent position in British politics and his prominent position among Christian circles in Britain, his devotion to this idea that Britain's interests would be best served by an idea of a Jewish state played a very important role in history. And this is before any Jewish intellectual or activist even talked about these ideas. So he's a very important figure. I call him in my book, Lobbying for Zionism, that hopefully would come out in Arabic this month. I call him the first lobbyist for Zionism in Britain.
طب الأرستقراطية البريطانية أيضا لماذا أخذت على عاتقها هذا الدور؟ تدعم اليهود، وبحسب ما أعرف هناك من كان يرى بأن فلسطين يجب أن تكون مستعمرة بريطانية، هناك منهم من قال لا، تحكمها بريطانيا إلى فترة ثم تعطى لليهود. لماذا الأرستقراطية البريطانية تحديدا؟
Yes, well, we have part of the British aristocracy, Jewish or non-Jewish, it doesn't matter, were, as I said before, worried about the mass immigration that began to arrive in Britain from Russia in the mid-19th century and towards the late 19th century. And therefore they liked the idea of diverting these Jews to Palestine. Some of them were imperialists. They really wanted to see Palestine as part of the British Empire. Some of them, like Lord Allenby, who would be the general who occupied Palestine in the First World War, believed that it belonged to the Christian world, and he wanted to renew the glorious days of the Crusaders in Palestine. Each of these aristocrats had his own agenda for supporting the idea of a British Palestine and a British Jewish Palestine. I think one of the most interesting one is Lord Balfour himself, the person who gave the famous or the infamous Balfour Declaration in 1917, in which Britain promised the Zionist movement that Palestine would become a Jewish homeland. Balfour himself was one of the most important politicians fighting against Jewish immigration from Russia to Britain. In 1905 and 1906, he moved to a legislation in the British Parliament not to allow Jewish immigrants to come into Britain. And he became the most important supporter of the idea of creating a Jewish state in Palestine. So you had two groups of aristocrats. One who wanted Palestine to be part of the British Empire. Not all of them wanted it to be necessarily a Jewish Palestine. I think many viewers are familiar with this legendary figure of Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia wanted very much Palestine to be part of the British Empire, but he didn't want it to be a Jewish state. He thought it should have been part of an Arab state that would be very loyal to the British Empire. But the other aristocrats in Britain thought that not only it is important for Palestine to be part of the British Empire, it will serve the British Empire better.
لا أبالغ إن قلت بأنه بروفيسور إيلان بابيه من أفضل وأجرأ من كتب عن ذلك. حتى كتابك يعني التطهير العرقي في فلسطين وصفوه بأنه من أجرأ الردود على الرواية الإسرائيلية. بس هل التطهير العرقي في فلسطين بدأ بعام النكبة عام 48 أم قبل، حتى في خلال الانتداب البريطاني على فلسطين؟
Absolutely. The Zionist movement came to Palestine with the idea that to make Palestine a Jewish state, you have to get over the problem of the fact that the vast majority of people in Palestine are not Jews, are Palestinians, Muslims mainly, but also a large Christian community. And they were looking for a way of, I would call it, de-Arabizing, in turning Palestine from an Arab country to a Jewish country. Their ability to do it depended on their own capacity and depended on how much the new rulers of Palestine, Britain, that ruled Palestine between 1918 and 1948, would allow them to do that. So the first ethnic cleansing of Palestine was quite minimal, because it was done in the 1920s when Britain was still responsible for law and order and did not allow the Zionist movement to go on a very vast project of ethnic cleansing. But in 1926, the Zionist movement bought land mainly from owners of land who were not Palestinians, who lived in Beirut. And on that land, there were already 11 to 13, some would say even 15 Palestinian villages. And with the help of the British, already in 1926, these 13 Palestinian villages were expelled and their land became the first Zionist colonies in Palestine. But the most important moment in the history of Palestine came in 1948, when Britain decided to end its rule on Palestine and created this vacuum because it was not very clear what would follow the British rule. And the moment it was clear to the Zionist leadership, and especially to the most important leader of the Zionist movement at the time, David Ben-Gurion, who became later the first Israeli prime minister, that it was very clear to them, the moment they knew that Britain is not going to rule Palestine anymore, to prepare a project, a plan for expelling as many Palestinians as possible. And they began the ethnic cleansing, the mass expulsion of Palestinians, already when Britain was still in Palestine. Britain left Palestine on the 15th of May, 1948. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine started 3 months before, in February 1948. In fact, most of the Palestinians who lived in towns in Palestine, such as Jaffa, Haifa, Akka, Safad, Baisan, all these people who lived in towns, and also West Jerusalem, were expelled by Israel before the British left Palestine, before the end of the British mandate on the 15th of May in 1948. This is a very important historical fact, because even the liberal Zionists, and unfortunately even some friends of the Palestinians say, well, the Palestinians became refugees because on the 15th of May 1948, when Britain was still responsible for law and order, 250,000 Palestinians were refugees before the 15th of May 1948 as a result from the ethnic cleansing. The ethnic cleansing continued after the 15th of May 1948 because the Arab world was unable to stop the ethnic cleansing. And by the time we get to the end of 1948, the Israeli forces were able to expel half of Palestine's Arab population, destroy half of the Palestinian villages, more than 500 out of 1,000, and demolish and destroy most of the Arab neighborhoods in the mixed towns of Jaffa and Haifa and Akka and Safad, and totally destroyed Palestinian towns such as Baisan and Tiberias. So within 9 months, Palestine was totally destroyed in what the Palestinians call the Nakba, and I call the ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
طب التطهير العرقي هذا هل ما زال موجود حقيقة في أجندة أي حكومة إسرائيلية، حتى لو لبست حكومة ما ثوب السلام مع الفلسطينيين؟ موجود هذا البرنامج بطرق مختلفة، تطهير عرقي بطيء مثلا؟
Ethnic cleansing never stopped to be an Israeli method. The main reason is that despite everything I described of what happened in the Nakba, still half of the Palestinians remained inside Palestine. And in 1948, Israel did not occupy the whole of Palestine. What today we call the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were not part of Israel until 1967. So when Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, it did not only occupy a space, it also occupied people. So after expelling nearly 1 million Palestinians, they now became again ruler of another 1.5 million Palestinians, or even 2 million Palestinians. So Israel, because it wanted to continue to be an exclusive Jewish country, had to deal with the fact after 1967 that now it's ruling millions of Palestinians, not just a small Palestinian minority that existed in Israel before 1948 to 1967. I claim that since 1967, what the Israelis did is, first of all, a more, as you say, a slow or more gradual ethnic cleansing of the people of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. From 1967 until today, Israel, in different methods, expelled more than 300,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But more importantly, in a way, replaced for a while ethnic cleansing with military rule. If I cannot expel you from your village, I will not allow you to leave the village. And therefore, I don't have to include you in my demography. I can continue to rule you without any basic rights and not to worry by the fact that actually demographically you are endangering my Jewish majority. Ethnic cleansing became again a method in the last 2 years in Gaza, alongside the genocide that we have seen that began on the 8th of October 2023. Israel did ethnic cleansing within the Gaza Strip, moving all the time people from the north to the south, from the south to the north. I do believe this Israeli government is quite convinced that the way it destroyed the infrastructure in Gaza would push a lot of Palestinians to leave Gaza. And that's another way of doing an ethnic cleansing. I'm also very worried. I'm talking to you from Nazareth, where we have, the community of Palestinian citizens of Israel who suffer from a very high level of criminality in their own villages and towns, which is encouraged or at least ignored by Israel. And a very crime-infested environment can also lead people to leave. So yes, I'm afraid that this Zionist mindset, this akliya, is hoping that there would be less Arabs inside whatever Israel would be, whether it would include the West Bank and Gaza or only part of the West Bank. They want it to be exclusively Jewish.
طيب بروفيسور إيلان، هناك كتاب جمع بالنسبة إلي يعني اثنين من أهم المفكرين والمؤرخين، يعني السيد نعم تشومسكي وبروفيسور إيلان بابيه، وكان عبارة عن حوارات معكما، وجاء في كتاب سمي غزة في أزمة. الكتاب في عام 2010-2011 صدر. هذا الكتاب من يقرأ، وإن كان في تخصيص كبير لغزة، خاصة في أعقاب عملية الرصاص المسكوب في غزة، تقول فيه تحديدا أنت كأنه ما يحدث الآن في غزة وما حدث في السنتين الماضيتين. ما الذي كنت تستشرف تتوقع بخصوص غزة؟
Yes, when we wrote the book in 2009, Noam Chomsky and I, we already noticed that Gaza is a different case for Israel. Somehow the successive Israeli governments believed that they found a way of dealing with the West Bank after 2 intifadas through the collaboration, some sort of collaboration with the Palestinian Authority, through increasing the number of Jewish settlers in the West Bank, in ruling the West Bank with an iron fist, and making sure that there will not be a third intifada. So most Israeli policymakers thought, we can deal with the West Bank. Yes, sometimes you have resistance, what they will call terrorism, but it's under control. Gaza was a different case, and we noted it in 2009. First of all, Israel never convinced a large number of Jews to settle in Gaza. At the best, it convinced at the time before they decided to leave the Gaza Strip, they convinced only 5,000 Jews to move to Gaza, whereas 800,000 Jews moved to the West Bank. Secondly, it was clear that the people of Gaza are not going to give in easily to the Israeli occupation. From the very beginning, I think one of the main reasons is that Gaza is to remember how the Gaza Strip was created. I don't think how many people realize that there was no Gaza Strip before 48. This is an Israeli invention, the strip, because Israel was unable to find a place to which to push in 48 hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the south. They created this strip like a mega refugee camp. So the people of Gaza are mostly 70% and even more are refugees from 1948. So there is a certain resistance there to occupation, to colonization. And the Israelis all the time were looking for ways of dealing with it, and they felt they are not succeeding in the same way that they did in the West Bank. So came Ariel Sharon in 2005 and says, I have a great solution. We'll take out all the Jewish settlers from Gaza so we don't have to protect them. We will turn this mega refugee camp into a mega prison. We will build a wall around it and keep an eye on it from the outside. Somehow, I don't know how did they think that people would be able to live like this, but they believed that this was a solution. The people of Gaza showed that this is not a solution. They resisted through, first of all, electing the Hamas to represent them, although I don't think most people necessarily identify with the ideology of the Hamas, but they identified with the idea that you are not happy as living as an inmate in a mega prison. And they started to resist. Now, resistance allows the Israelis in their own mind to be even more cruel in their repression. And what Chomsky and I noted, that as the years go by from the moment the Israelis took out the settlers from the Gaza Strip, every time that there is an act of resistance, they allow themselves to escalate the response. And they started to do things that, now they don't look as terrible because of what happened in the last 2 years, which is far worse. In the end of 2008 and beginning of 2009, Israel used the most advanced military technology against a space of 2 million people, not against an army, against a civilian space. They used the most advanced aircrafts, terrible kinds of bombs that nobody used anywhere else in the world, artillery from the ground, from the sea. I don't know how many of our viewers ever experienced the fall of a bomb of 1 ton over their head. This by itself can traumatize you for life. And this became genocidal. I already in 2009, I said the Israeli policy is not retaliation against the Palestinian resistance in Gaza. The Israeli policy is believing that genocide is possible as the only way of dealing with the 2 million people in Gaza, because we cannot do there what we can do in the West Bank or with the Palestinians inside Israel. And in the book, we warn about it. We wrote it in 2010, and we unfortunately, what happened in the last 2 years show that we were right.
كان في شيء لافت في هذا الكتاب غزة في أزمة، هو عندما ذكرت يعني في الكتاب بأنه إسرائيل بنت في النقب مدينة تشبه أي مدينة عربية، فيما بعد في عام 2006 أصبحت هذه المدينة تحاكي مدينة غزة، ثم أعطيت الأوامر للجنود وهم يتدربون، وهنا المهم، في تدمير كل شيء في غزة بلا أي رادع أخلاقي. إذن ما رأيناه على مدى 2 في غزة هو ما وضع في عام 2006.
Yes, it began, you train in a city with nobody in it. And then you go to the real operation, and you still think that the people in there are like the people in the training. Namely, they don't exist. You can remove them as if they are not human beings. Yes, I was very fearful, as I wrote in my book it was Noam Chomsky in 2010. I was very fearful that this dehumanization of the Palestinians as it appeared in the training would be replicated, would be repeated when the real attack on Gaza would happen. And, even I did not expect the level of brutality to be the way it was. I mean, when I watched hundreds of selfies, as they are called, when Israeli soldiers film themselves and explain what they are doing and show what they are doing, you understand that the level of inhumanity is really even beyond what I anticipated in 2010. It's very worrying. It's very, for me as an Israeli Jew, is worrying particularly because this is the younger generation of Israeli Jews. The soldiers are in ages between 18 and 21. And if, as young people, they treat other human beings in such a way, including babies and women, what would happen when they will be grown-ups? As I say in a recent book of mine, the state of Israel has become something else. I call it the state of Judea. It became a far more fanatic, a far more racist, a far more extreme state compared to the state of Israel in the 20th century. And this is also reflected in the level of brutality that we have seen in Gaza in the last 2 years.
طيب، يعني كل ما فعلته إسرائيل في غزة خاصة في السنتين الأخيرتين جعل إسرائيل يعني معزولة منبوذة تقريبا عالميا. هذه الحالة من السهل على إسرائيل أن تنجو منها، تشفى منها، أم لا الوضع تغير وربما ستبقى هذه الحالة إلى سنوات وسنوات وربما تزداد هذه العزلة أكثر أيضا خاصة لدى الشعوب؟
I'm afraid, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm afraid that that kind of Israel, that is, you're absolutely right, is isolated, at least in the eyes of most people in the world, maybe not in the eyes of governments, is not going to change dramatically in the next future, in the near future, sorry. And if I'm right, and you can only guess about the future, you cannot know for certain, but if I'm right that the same kind of Israel would remain, by the way, even if Benjamin Netanyahu is going to lose the next election, then the isolation would increase and would move from the societies to the governments. If the same kind of Israel we have seen in the last 2 years continue to exist after the end of the genocide, when it will move to do similar things, God forbid, in the West Bank or towards the Palestinian community inside Israel. I do hope I'm wrong. I'm not saying it because I want to be right. I do hope I'm wrong. But I have a feeling that the world, including the countries who tolerate Israel now or even support Israel now, should realize that they are going to face in the near future a state that would be very difficult to justify to their own people why they are continuing to supporting it. This is not a state that they could describe as defending itself. They could not be defined it anymore as the only democracy in the Middle East. I claim they could not even define it anymore as a Jewish state, because for me, a Jewish state does not do what Israel has done in the last 2 years. This is going to create a real problem, not for Israel, but for all those who allow it to continue with its policies. Will it really move them to act? I hope so, because if they will not act, that is, the world will not act, then Palestinians would go on desperate operation like the one they did on the 7th of October, which was no benefit for anyone. So there is a duty, especially given the beginning of our conversation today, there is a duty for Europe in particular that created this problem to come and say to Israel, no more. We don't allow you to continue. And we have the power to stop you with sanctions, with strong pressure, but they're not doing it yet. And 2 years of genocide did not move them to do it. I hope that they realize that this is their task. You know, Europeans think that their role is to mediate between Arabs and Jews. I say to them, no, your role now is to defend the Palestinians. This is the most sacred mission that you have as Europeans now, especially when you have a president in America who is not so much interested in the fate of the Palestinians. I think there's a lot of American politicians who do care about the Palestinians, and they will probably one day come to power, and then the isolation and the pressure would be more effective.
شكرا جزيلا بروفيسور إيلان بابيه على أنك كنت ضيفا معي في برنامج 50 دقيقة. كنت معي من الناصرة. شكرا لك.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
شكرا لكم على هذه المتابعة. إلى حلقة أخرى من 50 دقيقة. تحياتي.